Okay, so thank you all for joining us on the afternoon of day 3 of the Telltales Festival, and we've got Amy Barlow, the Head of Academic Development and a National Teaching Fellow, here to talk to us about formative feedback. And I know this is an area that Amy's done a lot of research and innovation in over the years, so even though I know Amy and her work quite well, I'm quite interested to hear what she's got to say myself, and I will now stop sharing my screen and hand over to Amy. Any questions, do add them in the chat, and Amy will either pick them up as we're going through or have time at the end. Any technical issues, do either send me a private message or post for everyone in the chat, and I'll see what I can do.
That's great. Thanks very much, Stu, and welcome everybody. We've got a rapid fire session for you today with 5 very practical steps that you can take to increase formative feedback for your students. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what formative feedback is, why it's important. I know that this won't be new to many of you, and it's something that people have been doing for many, many years. But it's always good to kind of renew practice. And for those of you that are joining that are perhaps more early career lecturers, you should hopefully find some useful tips going forward. So as Stuart said, please use the chat and I will sort of pick up any questions in the discussion. And also there'll be some time at the end of the session today. So what I'd like to do first of all is, could you just introduce yourself for me in the chat? And I would also like you to have a think about what challenges you face with regards to assessment and feedback. So is there anything in particular that you're finding difficult, or is something that you're kind of wanting to problem solve today? Please just write that in the chat, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to have a think and put something down there. So introduce yourself and the main challenges or challenge that you face with assessment and feedback. And while you're doing that, I will just share my slides. Okay. Struggling to see the chat, so I'll come out of that. Right, let's have a look. So yeah, absolutely, Rich. There we get a lot of comments about the kind of the scale of this, and introducing formative tasks can feel like you're doubling up. So we'll have a think about how you can do it for large groups. Yeah, absolutely, Heather. So thinking about how we can do something that's valuable to students, but also doable in the time that we have again. Yes, absolutely. Annabelle there has mentioned engagement with the feedback. Are the students accessing it? Are the students reading it completely? Yeah, and I think John, that's absolutely a really good point there. So getting the students to do it when it doesn't count, because they do fixate on that number, don't they? So let's have a look. Chris is interested in some peer feedback. Yeah, we can touch on that. Yeah, and sort of acting on the feedback. That's great. Can we just check that we've got the mics muted, Stu, if that's possible?
Yep, just a second.
Thank you.
I might mute you because I will just mute all.
That's fine. I can unmute myself.
Right. Yeah, everyone's muted.
Thank you. So Jim is saying, I've got a lot of students that are not keen on formative feedback. It has worked up in the past, but the low risk elements, yeah, absolutely. So thinking about that low risk, that safe space compared to the summative. That's great. Thank you for your comments, everybody. Okay, I'm going to go back to my slides now. Starting to get the hang of WebEx, having not really used it very much. Okay. So I'm going to give you, as I say, just 5 very, very practical, useful things that you can do in your practice. You can adapt for the way that works for you. They're things that are quite tried and tested, and we can talk about how you can scale this up if you've got large student numbers as well. So I'm just going to take a bit of time to define formative feedback, because it is new to some people, and it has something of a sort of definitional fuzziness. That's what the literature kind of refers to it as, because it's something different to everybody. But I particularly like this quote from Al, which is about the idea that when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative, and they are able to adjust as they go along. They're able to add a bit of salt if they need to, or a bit of spice. They're able to kind of amend what they're doing, and it's that nice kind of feeling of cooking in the kitchen, maybe with a glass of wine, some music on. It's all very very relaxing. And then the summative is that judgment bit. So the cook's no longer in the picture. The soup's in front of the guest, or the essay's in front of the lecturer in this case, and that's the summative part. So some of you might not be familiar with the TESTA project, which I've mentioned there in terms of a definition. It's transforming assessment and feedback. Transforming student experience through assessment. Getting my acronyms mixed up. And this is a research methodology that we engage with at the university. In the TESTA definition, the formative assessment is something that's required. I think this is something that we unfortunately have missed a bit of a trick with in terms of our module descriptors. We are aware of it, but if you are doing formative and it's counting towards your assessment load and it's compulsory, it might be pass-fail, it might just be that the students have to do it. It's not always captured on our documentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can bring formative in without doubling up your assessment load. And the important thing there, it doesn't count towards the final grade and gives feedback. We have a definition in our assessment for learning policy, which has very much put the emphasis on formative and how that kind of works together. So this is what our policy says about it. And it should affect what the student does next, but also what the academic does next. So having these kind of low risk, quick and dirty formative assessments early on in the teaching block will give you such a good idea about where your students are and what you need to adjust as well as a lecturer. So this is what students in our research project about feedback tell us when we ask them about formative. So we had a comment about how do you get the students to do it if it doesn't count, which is something which we encounter a lot because they do fixate on the number, as we know, they fixate on that mark. And I think the links between the formative and the summative are key, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that. But it's this kind of cyclical nature of perhaps doing a small bit of writing and some feedback, which then culminates in the summative assessment, so that you're not marking a load of formative and marking a summative. It's okay to give the majority of your feedback early on in the module. So it's this idea that you don't necessarily have to have a big spike of student and staff effort at the end of the teaching block when the assignments come in. That workload can perhaps be distributed in different ways. The students tell us that they really value it. They don't always recognise when it's happening, which is another problem entirely. But they do want to see that it's going to directly help their coursework. So this is what the literature says about formative assessment. So we've got Nicole there, who's a very sort of well-known expert on this. Enables students to internalise the criteria and goals. So these kind of activities are going to help the students to understand how we mark and some of our terminology, which can be a bit alienating. And I will show you some tools for students that we can use a bit later on. So as Hattie says, and I mentioned, you can help to adapt your teaching if you get this gauge of performance early on. And Graham Gibbs there on that third quote, very well-known expert in assessment, and actually founded the Tester project initially, talks about feedback being prompt. And he actually got us into trouble at our university in Winchester by having a load of bookmarks printed which said, if feedback isn't back within 5 days, it's not worth doing, or something, which very quickly got recalled by senior management. But it's this idea that you want to capture students' engagement, so it has to be timely, and that's very hard to do with the numbers that we have and the kind of that assessment of learning that we have at the end of a module. And there's quite a lot of research which shows that, unsurprisingly, if you increase formative, you increase learning gains with the students. Okay. So it's about this process of helping the students to take on the goal or the learning target themselves and be able to set their own goals and monitor progress towards them. So good formative feedback will have some very practical steps that students can take. They know how to implement them, and they know how to improve for the next part of the assessment. So I've included this quote because it is it's kind of a popular opinion about this. It doesn't have to be that the formative and the summative pair up, but I think in the current climate that we're working in, and we do want that engagement from students, you are already giving yourself a head start if your formative assignment links in to your summative. And I can give an example of that. So for example, if you have an essay, and you have that's your final assessment, is a large piece of work, you could ask the students to submit annotated bibliographies at an earlier date. So you're asking them to shift some of their effort forward in the teaching block, provide some insights into what they're going to be reading, what they're going to be talking about. They can get some quite quick feedback on that, and then that can feed in to their essay. So that's kind of an example of how the two might be linked. You may be running student blogs, which is something that we had a session on earlier. So students who are writing kind of regular small chunks, having comments from their peers, and then that sort of finalises in maybe a reflective assignment which looks back over the blogs and kind of picks out something in detail. The key thing there is that reflective assignment is small. And if you have a look at the policy, and if you're worried about workload and word count, you will see that we've been very clear about assessment for learning and formative feedback, and you can reduce your word count in some places. We'll play around with it slightly. So this is a fantastic step to take, especially if you teach level 4. So this example is where the students do the assignment, but they do it early on. And normally the comment that comes back about this is that they haven't had all of the content and all of the curriculum in order to write the assignment. You want to be thinking about what they're able to do given what they've kind of covered, and really think about what the learning outcomes might be, because it might be that the learning outcomes are more in level 4 about them engaging with reflection on their performance. So, you know, perhaps that particular bit of content isn't so key. So in this instance, the students do the assignment early on, they mark it, and they submit it with a marked rubric, and then that kind of conversation, that formative activity that they do, also has the input from the tutor as well. Many of you will be familiar with this idea of feedback that feeds forward into subsequent assignments, and that is where formative can come in, because you're giving an opportunity for the feedback to be front loaded a bit. And again, this counts as feedback that the students are getting, as marking. You can show it to your external. It doesn't have to duplicate the effort as well. So we want students to read their feedback and we want them to act on it. And formative tasks do help to increase that. And I know many people engage in this, but it's quite a good thing to do, given that we're going to be working primarily in the VLE. So you can set this up as an online activity where the students have to mark a past assignment. You need to get permission to share it, obviously, if it's from a past student, or you can, as I've done in the past, kind of mock one up yourself. A bit time consuming initially, but just getting them to engage, it doesn't matter too much how perfect or not perfect the essay is. They can have a go at marking it, applying the criteria. They can then post this to the group. You can ask them to debate it. And actually the useful part of that is the conversation and the interpretation of the criteria. It's great to choose one that's across a grade boundary, and I do this a lot with moderation meetings. So something's a 58 and you're thinking, what would it have had to have done to get up to that kind of 60 mark? That sometimes is a really good way to engage the students in that conversation. This can all be done online. It can all be done in an online discussion that happens asynchronously, or you can sort of preset this task early on and bring the students back to discuss it. Also great for tutorial groups as well. Okay, for the science kind of discipline amongst us, I want to show you this short video about a two-stage exam. I wasn't sure whether to show it because it does include a very crowded lecture room, which we know that we won't be having, certainly for the foreseeable future. But all of this can be replicated if you are doing online exams or limited time exams online. You can replicate this kind of cyclical process. So I will just stop sharing this particular screen and bring that up. Okay. Stuart, can you just check that you can hear this and see it? And if not, can you give me unmute yourself and give me a wave? It should work.
So the two-stage exam is a very simple process. You do an exam just like normal, an individual exam. Students hand that exam in, and then you immediately get them into groups of 4, and you have them do the exact same exam again.
Once you have your group of 4, stay seated and raise your hands. One of our TAs or instructors will give you a group exam, and then you may start.
You want to give them one piece of paper, though. They have to agree on the answers. So they basically teach each other what they got wrong. It's very interesting and exciting to see students arguing about your topic with enthusiasm, and there's high fives, swearing, and it's very interesting. They're happy when they get it right, and they're upset when they get it wrong, but it's good for them to know right away.
I think for me, the wonderful thing about two-stage exams is it's almost like a second chance. There's a first portion where we get to test what we've learned and how we've studied, and a second portion where we get to go over some of our answers with classmates. So we get different sides of learning. I definitely feel like I learn more and I remember more.
We've done research that shows that student retention is better when they do the exams in this format. So they correct themselves immediately what they got wrong, and then they retain that information better. I don't ever want to do an exam another way because it's so exciting and interesting to see students really really engaging with your material. A colleague of mine in life sciences had a TA that burst into tears when she saw a two-stage exam because they're talking about biology. So it's very exciting to see as an instructor.
Fantastic. So very enthusiastic sort of indictment, I suppose, for that particular methodology. It's up to you how you might frame that. You could do it completely as a formative task, and you can do it online because you can just say to the students, look, in your own time, you need to meet up to have the conversation around what mark you've got and to wrestle with the questions. And then as a group, you can have them nominating a person to send back their final answers or not. You can do that completely formative. Or you can, if you're brave, assign marks. So you could assign a chunk of marks to the first version of the exam that the student does, and then a chunk of marks to the second. That's a bit more controversial with students, and I would suggest kind of discussing this with them. And again, it's something that works particularly well in level 4. Okay, so we had a comment about, how do you do this for big numbers? And there's no real easy answer for that other than engaging quite a lot in peer feedback activities. So what I would say is if you're going to ask students to do a draft, we know that they really, really value that feedback on a draft early on. It's something that kind of prompts them to work more sort of consistently, time on task with assessment, to spread the time that they're working on the assessment throughout the module. What you can do is just sample a small percentage of those assignments, and you could use something like Camtasia screen capture or Panopto, which we're going to have, or even a Google Meet recorded, to speak to the cohort and say, I've had a look at your drafts, and I'm going to summarise for you what the strengths and weaknesses are and some of the common problems that I saw in your draft, so that you can act on these. They don't always value the cohort feedback as highly. However, I still think that is better than not having that opportunity. So it's less work for you, and then perhaps when you're coming to mark those students' essays, if they've paid attention, you will sort of have less grey hairs from repeating yourself in terms of the same kind of errors or mistake. Okay, and I'm on to, I think, my final step that you can take. I'll recap these. I wanted to pick up something which was mentioned in the chat, which was, we can do formative, we can do all these great things, but are the students going to read it? Are they going to use it? We know from our analytics in Moodle that unfortunately they don't always access their feedback. They will go to MyPort and they will look at their numerical grade. We have been piloting a different workflow for this, which would involve the students having to read their feedback, make a response before their numerical grade is released. Quite controversial, but it is something that we are piloting, very gently piloting. I might say that's not coming in anytime soon, but it is something that we're looking at. So when we talk about feedback literacy, and this has come out of a toolkit developed by Advanced HE, which I will show you, there are these kind of domains. So there's the kind of knowing domain, which is students understanding their feedback in terms of why they have it, what it's for, the standards and criteria, and they see it as a learning resource rather than just a justification for the number. And that really is the mindset shift that we're trying to bring about. The being side of the domain is a bit more about their identity and their emotional readiness to receive feedback. And this is something which is coming through in the literature quite strongly. Something that I'm quite interested in is where our students are emotionally when they receive that feedback. Are they anxious? Are they are they in a place to read it and to engage with it objectively, and understand that it's about their work and not about them as a person. And then that key thing at the bottom, the idea of taking some action. So this is from a toolkit. It's called developing engagement with feedback, DEFT. So it's on the Advanced HE website, and there are a lot of resources in there, like this one here, where there are activities that you can do. This is fantastic if you're a personal tutor. You can do this with small tutorial groups. And basically they are sort of set activities where you can facilitate group discussion around criteria and standards. And you can take some time for students to have their feedback in front of them across multiple assignments, and to start to kind of think about what the common themes are with that. So there's a load of really useful tools there. And what I will do is show you how we have developed this into a tool in Moodle that you can use. So we've done the work for you. So I would suggest that if you want to increase your students' engagement with the formative feedback, or with all of the feedback that they're getting, you can include this resource when you're sending back their feedback. So if we go to useful sites on Moodle, you've all got this, and it is this one here, how to use feedback effectively. So in we go. So this is all based around that DEFT toolkit, and we had the wonderful Emma Coppins develop this for us. And basically it's for students, and it's based on research around their receptiveness to feedback, and what we can do to help them to feel able to really engage with their feedback, and potentially if they've got a bad mark that they're not happy with, which is when we can see sort of lower levels of engagement. So we've got this tool first of all for the students, and it says use this tool to start reflecting on when and how to make the best use of your feedback. So it's get started. And then it says, look at your grade. Are you ready to deal with your feedback? And it might be that the answer is no. I remember doing this. I mean, we had paper cover sheets, and it was, go and pick it up from the cubby hole. But I do remember hiding it in the bottom drawer for a while and not being able to look at it. It's an emotional business for some people. So they might say that actually, no, I'm not really ready to deal with the feedback just yet. I'm quite stressed because I haven't done as well as I wanted to. And so it gives them some advice about waiting a couple of days. And there's also this resource here about mindsets, and it talks about fixed and growth mindset as a way to help the students to engage with that. So if we go back to the beginning, and we do get started again, and this time they are ready to deal with their feedback. Is the meaning clear? And they might say no. Hopefully they won't, but occasionally some of the language can be quite alienating. In here they've got a glossary, and the glossary has been developed to show them all of these lovely phrases that we like to use, some of the jargon sometimes, which can help them to understand their feedback. And if we move down on the page past that initial tool, there's a guide that was written by students for students about their feedback. Some information about what feedback is. And then there's also this kind of interactive tool. And this one is quite interesting. The feedback I've been given is really unhelpful. I can't do anything with it. I'm sure this won't apply to any of you here, but occasionally we know that this can happen. And it just helps them to be a bit objective in the way that they're receiving the feedback. And then it has a further link here. I'm struggling to use my feedback. And then again, they're going back to these kind of phrases. So I would, you can link to this site for the students. As I said, it's here. Link to that site. You could put it in the kind of the text box if you're returning assignments, and ask the students to engage with it. And if you were looking for some sort of out-of-the-box formative activities, as I say, the wider toolkit has got some fantastic elements in it there as well. Okay, so quick and snappy, 5 steps to formative feedback. Let's just have a quick recap. So formative, directly linking into the summative. Sorry, I'll present that a bit bigger so you can see it. Formative mirroring the summative, and you're halfway there because you've already got the buy-in. Think about doing some mock marking of past assignments. Again, you can construct these yourselves or ask for permission to share one. Because it would be shared publicly, just need to watch out with Turnitin for this, if you do use Turnitin, because you might end up with a high similarity store. Two-stage exam, very, very interesting. Good for the sciences, good for that kind of discussion, which again can be completely mirrored in terms of the VLE and an online experience. Some feedback on drafts, which involves sampling, so you're not looking at all of them. And then the use of our developing engagement with feedback toolkit. So hopefully some good recipes there to increase formative feedback. I'm really interested in the steps that you are already taking for this, and if there's anything that you'd like to share in terms of good practice, that would be really, really useful, because we always want to hear about that. So what I will do, I'll come out of this now and we can have a bit of a discussion. I can answer any questions that you might have. Just stop that. And we can have a look at this. Okay, so I'm just going to have a little look at the chat here. Fantastic. So some lovely conversations going on here in terms of use of feedback. Okay, so Rich has asked, withholding a grade until the feedback has been read, would that mean we have to grade their response to our feedback? No, no, absolutely not. It's more about them taking the action than us kind of reading and acting on it, because that would get insane in terms of workload. There is a really good tool called cyclical marking sheet, and it's something that the students have to hand in with their essay, and it refers back to the past essay, and they have to say what they've focused on in terms of trying to improve and what they want you to specifically focus on in your feedback. And they have to hand that in with their essay, and then they do the same. So it kind of links a bit of a kind of thread up there. Are there any questions at this point? Would you like to come in with any questions? I can see that we've had quite a few join since the start there, so I'm happy to recap anything as well. I can, Heather. I will dig it out for you. I've got it as a Word document, so it would have to be. You might have to kind of amend it for yourself. But I'll make a note for that, and we do have a participant list. Okay. Peter has says, does the toolkit include peer review and inner feedback method? There is, yeah, it is heavily influenced by David Nicol and Graham Gibbs as well. But I think the focus of it is on peer review, but it's more about the students mapping when they're getting feedback, and it's really sort of useful for, dare I say it, some of our metrics that we use in terms of our modular evaluations in the NSS, because a lot of the feedback that the students get is quite invisible to them. So if you sit them down and say, right, where are you going to get feedback throughout the year here? Where's that going to happen? They can kind of map it out in that way. So Karen said we use presentations of dissertation ideas to give them feedback. Fantastic. And do the students feedback for each other, Karen, or is that mainly you giving them feedback?
So what we would do is we would have the students do a presentation in front of a group of us, including their supervisor and their a group of the other students within their cohort. And then the supervisor would start the feedback, and then the the other students would join in, and so it gives them quite a good opportunity to run by ideas and things like that, and then just get some feedback from everybody, really.
Yeah, that's fantastic. How early on do you do that, just out of interest?
Within the first couple of months. So really it is very, very preliminary and very early on, but then they can explore their ideas and they can put their ideas out there and get some feedback on them. But also if they're a little bit more progressed, they can then talk about how they're thinking of going about doing the research, etc. as well. So
fantastic. Do they get nervous about the presentation, or do they kind of see that it's quite informal?
I think they get that it's quite informal, so actually that works, because it would be within a seminar. So
absolutely fantastic. I think as well it can work the other way around, where the formative tasks might be small pieces of writing or things that are collected as the teaching block goes through, and then the final part of that is actually the students presenting on one thing that they did earlier on in the form of a mini conference or something like that. Fantastic. Does anybody else want to share any questions or any examples? Stuart, I know that you might have something in terms of, sort of the co-creation hat on in terms of this.
Put me on the spot. Thanks, Amy.
We keep doing this to each other. I think. You can get me back. I'm sorry.
Yes, not sure if you're chairing any of my future sessions, but I'm going to have to rope you in. I don't know. I was not necessarily examples, but something I was musing about based on discussions in the chat is timing of the formative assessments, and I think that is something which is useful in co-creating with students. We've had quite a few sessions over the week so far which have talked about setting expectations with students, and I think that one thing that hasn't come up much is timing of assessment. We've talked in some of my sessions, I've seen it in other sessions as well, about timing of taught sessions and engagement in asynchronous sessions, but I think co-creating the timing of formative assessment might be an interesting thing to maybe kick off with, like to lead an opening session, particularly with a level 4 cohort who are coming in unfamiliar with how we do assessment in higher education in a lot of circumstances, talking to them about why we do it, so broaching exactly the kind of things that you've identified in the DEF toolkit, but then saying, so when and how would you want this? Because I think sometimes that's the issue, and you didn't necessarily go into it when you were talking about TESTA, but one of the key parts of the TESTA methodology is just about exploring assessment bunching, and that students, obviously, they see their whole course in front of them, whereas we might see just the one module we're coordinating or what have you, and talking to them, co-creating their formative assessment can ensure that we're not overburdening their assessment load in that way, because they'll know actually week 6 is when everyone's decided to be a good time to drop a formative assessment on us, so I'm not going to do it because it doesn't carry any weight. Whereas actually they might value having a stab at something in week 2 because they've had a couple of lectures, it's sparked their imagination, but they know it's going to be rough.
Yeah, absolutely. I can agree more, and the sooner that they can sort of get reading and get writing is obviously really, really helpful. You've brought up a really important point there, Stuart, which is about, as you say, assessment bunching. So whenever we're looking at adding these layers of kind of assessment in, it's so important to have a course team discussion about what you're doing when. We have had some courses in TESTA where they've been absolutely staggered that we tell them that, you know, you've got over 100 items of of assessment in your three-year course, and it's because everybody was doing really, really amazing things in terms of formative, but they were all doing it at the same time, so it just ballooned and ballooned and ballooned. And then they were saying, well, the students aren't here in the last 3 weeks of teaching, they're not turning up to lectures, and they thought that it was because they wanted to go home, they were done for the summer, and it was actually because they had huge deadlines and all this assignment work to do, and they were prioritising that. So yeah, absolutely, that course conversation is key. Peter says we should do assessment maps. Yeah, absolutely. There is a tool that does this called Map My Assessment, which was developed by Greenwich University. But also that is what TESTA does. So if you want us to come and do the research methodology on your course for you, part of that is a an audit to see what's happening when, the variety of assessment, all of these things. So we're running that again for a cohort next year. Yes, it was, absolutely. Yeah, I think the keynote was that? It might have been 2018, and it was probably mentioned by Duncan. Yeah, so he would have been from Greenwich. They got a fantastic tool there. It's called Map My Assessment. We'd love to mandate it, Peter. They have done that in some institutions where it's part of periodic review. So it just needs some research assistant kind of resource. At the moment, we're focusing on a cluster of about 10 to 15 courses at a time. I'm interested about other people's practice as well. Is there any other good examples of how you're using Formative? Does anybody have an assessment structure where you've got a mid-teaching block assessment, which fits quite nicely with the end assessment? They'll both be summative, but I'm wondering if there's any interesting kind of pairings there that people might be able to share.
Hi Amy, this is Catherine from Architecture. We do formative in every single module, and it is it's sometimes it's verbal, sometimes it's through a presentation, and sometimes it's written. It doesn't have to be typed, but it can be written, and that's probably because we've got studio projects, and so students are always presenting to us, and we're always giving verbal feedback and written feedback. Sometimes we'll do one, sometimes we'll do both, but it is quite time consuming. And this does feed forward. We always see it as a feed forward, but students' expectations are they expect it. And so if they don't get feed formative from us, they complain. So their expectations are quite high.
Yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes it is appropriate to look at what the course team are doing and say, actually, we are doing too much. We are doing above and beyond what we need to. And I'd imagine in the arts, I know we have had some case studies around this where all of that lovely dialogical feedback that happens in the studio and is actually quite informal. The students don't necessarily recognise as feedback. So it's fantastic that you're doing loads of it and that they come to expect it. And I think that is, as you say, a kind of part of your discipline there. Is it mainly in the first year? Do you kind of spread it out across years?
It's in every module in every year.
Okay.
So, and you're absolutely right. When we get complaints about feedback, they don't see the fact that we're constantly feeding back to them, and they don't see that as formative. And a few years ago, we found this to be a little bit of a problem to get the students to understand that, just to shift their mindset to recognise, because they would say things like, we haven't had any feedback. And I was interested in the Panopto session because I thought that was quite interesting how Jenny was saying it seemed to have quite a significant impact on the students' understanding of their role in receiving and acting on that feedback. I'm not sure we can do that across all of the modules, but certainly some modules we can.
Yes, absolutely, and it is frustrating that feedback is not always recognised. I think Stuart and I went to a presentation where somebody had used a feedback flag. So they actually had a physical flag and they would hold it up when they were doing feedback. In that developing engagement with feedback tool, there's a Map My Feedback task for students to do, where they kind of go through the whole, as I said, through the teaching blocks and say where they're getting feedback, when they're receiving it, and what form it will come in. That might be helpful for you in terms of helping them to.
It is interesting because I think we probably possibly tackled it in that every week we have a year meeting. So with every year group across the undergraduate and the postgraduate, they would have a year meeting. And we would stress at those meetings until I think over the years it sunk in that this is where the feedback is coming and the different modes in which they're receiving that feedback. And I suspect that they now understand that, but that would have that's taken time, and it's kind of part of our culture now. So teaching online is going to challenge how they see that feedback and how we provide that feedback. But we have had some group sessions after we had a final review. We were marking the students' work, and then we got them all together as a big group, and we had an open discussion. And the feedback from the students has been that that was one of the most useful and informative sessions. So they saw that as formative feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds fantastic.
It's a group session in WebEx. I mean, not
absolutely. And like Andre says, it gets them to engage with that assessment literacy and their understanding of it very early on. Okay, sure, no worries. We've got a few more minutes. Something that I did kind of want to mention was peer-to-peer feedback, because we didn't touch on that too much. We're actually finding in some of the data that's coming through that the students don't really appreciate the peer-to-peer feedback, because sometimes the students that are marking them don't necessarily put the same effort in. So it's been a really interesting, certainly for me, because I would really have advocated it. But we have had kind of a common theme coming through that the students say they're not really getting anything beneficial, and they feel like they can put a lot of time into their part of it and not necessarily get the same back, which is suggesting to us that we really need to work with how that's scaffolded, and actually if it's done badly or it doesn't necessarily work that well, it can be quite detrimental. So I would say light touch with the peer feedback and how to do this, and it is kind of very useful for them to see examples and mark them, but maybe that's more about providing an exemplar or a couple of past versions rather than them sort of working on each other with drafts. I like that idea, Peter. Drama students teaching other students, fantastic. Wouldn't that be lovely? You could get them in with your business students and get them to to talk about voice, and fantastic. Okay, if there aren't any questions, I think we will finish it there. As I say, it's been kind of a quick-paced, some practical ideas to take through. There's going to be some more sessions around this. I'm running the audio feedback introduction again on Friday. The recordings are all there, so you can see those. But if you wanted to hear a bit more about effective feedback and using your voice and video, that might be a next kind of step for you. So thank you, everybody. The slides will be available. I've made a note about the cyclical feedback sheet, and I'll aim to send that out to you, certainly to you, Heather. That's great, thank you. That would be great. That would be great, Rich. I think we do. I think this kind of community of support that's growing. We need somewhere that we can look at this. It's something that the team are thinking about. We're having a play around with some different platforms for this, so watch this space. But yeah, absolutely, it'd be great just to have a swap shop, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Okay, enjoy your afternoon, everybody. We've got tea at 3. If you did want to grab a cuppa and a biscuit and